for joining us on the Media Connection. I'm your host, Naima Latif, and we're here at the Illinois State Building for a very special exhibit, the Legacy Project. We'll be talking to Victor Salvo, who is Executive Director of the project, and we'll learn some things about a group of people that many think are different, but you'd be surprised how many are in history. We'll be right back.
Hi, my name is Victor Salvo. I am the Executive Director and creator of the Legacy Project, and we're standing in front of the Legacy Wall, which is our traveling installation celebrating the contributions LGBT people have made to world history and culture.
Who are some of the famous people that you're featuring here on the Legacy Project?
There's a number of people who one would regard as famous. There's Frida Kahlo, a very famous Mexican artist who is bisexual. There is also a movie star from the silent film era called Ramon Navarro. Leonard Bernstein is somebody that a lot of people recognize because of his concert series. He was the director of the New York Philharmonic. There's also Tchaikovsky, who was a composer, Russian composer. Dusty Springfield, who was very popular during the 1960s. Tennessee Williams, a playwright. Freddie Mercury, the rock and roll star. Michelangelo always gets a few eyebrows raised. There's quite a few famous people on here, actually. So,
what motivated you to put the Legacy Project together?
The project was really started when I was a much younger man in an effort to sort of answer questions that we had about our own origins, because we didn't know anything about our own history. It wasn't really taught and it wasn't really studied. And we kept hearing rumors about who was gay and who wasn't gay, and it started as a personal research project, trying to educate myself, and I just did that and did that and did that for a number of years, and we came to the conclusion that we needed to share this content in some way with LGBTQ youth so that they would have role models to grow up with, because we grew up without any. And especially at the time when the project was conceived was during the very earliest days of AIDS. We really kind of believed that if people knew how many LGBT people were already actually in their lives and in their day-to-day existence, people whose names they would recognize, perhaps they wouldn't hate us so much and they would be more helpful during the course of the AIDS crisis. So that was really how it started. It was a personal research project. More and more people got involved with it. Eventually we gave it a name, and we decided to create a physical installation so that we could sort of leapfrog over the education system to make this information publicly accessible, that anybody could walk up to it and read it, because most kids would be too afraid to go to a library and ask for a book, that was on that subject. So it was our way of sort of getting around the limitations placed on us.
Well, I see you have some very ancient people like Michelangelo. Mm-hmm. Is there anybody that surprised you from ancient history in discovering that they were LGBT?
Probably Alexander the Great, I think, and even though in his time in 323 BC, it was actually fairly common for people to sort of be kind of pansexual in some respects. I had never really put it together what his relationships were like, and then I was able to, in my research, find out that he was lovers with his General Hephaestion. And if you think about it, this all came about during the heyday of the whole don't ask, don't tell thing, and you find out that Alexander the Great, who is considered basically to be the greatest soldier that ever lived, his exploits are still taught in schools and universities and military establishments all over the world. He created what, basically the Hellenistic period of our history all evolved from the conquest of Alexander the Great, and to think about that he was lovers with his general the entire time, and they died literally within like 8 months of each other. And their story, their love story, is so compelling and heartbreaking. My favorite aspect of that is when Hephaestion died, Alexander threw himself on the body and refused to allow the body to be moved for 2 days. And then after he erected the funeral pyre to him, Alexander took a knife and cut off all of his own hair and folded it into the hands of General Hephaestion and vowed that they would be together again soon, and set fire to the pyre while his men stood by and openly wept. And 8 months later, Alexander himself died.
Wow. What are some other love stories you discovered in the course of doing research for this project?
Well, there's a very famous coupling of Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas. They're actually nominated together as a couple. We have only a couple of people who are actually nominated as couples. One I would probably draw your attention to over here. We refer to them as the Royal Manicurists because there's a bunch of different translations for their names. But this is really the oldest recorded same-sex couple in history. Their tomb was discovered during an excavation, I believe, in the 1964. And they were the only two people who were allowed to touch the pharaoh. And they are buried in their tomb. They're positioned in this particular image that you can see here. This is the sacred canonical position that indicates man and wife. So that was the positions that that men and women held, and yet these two men are depicted that way together. So they're considered to be the first recording of an actual same-sex couple, and that dates to 2400 BC, I believe. So that was actually, but we don't really know a whole lot about them besides like the artifacts that were gathered around them. Some people who actually aren't on the wall were also very eye-opening for me. Cary Grant was lovers with Randolph Scott for a number of years, and they ended up having to be sort of forced into these kind of lavender marriages that we used to call them at that time. But they lived together for a couple of decades actually before they were forced to separate by the studios. And I always found that was really tragic and also really cool because they remained close their entire life and they covered for each other essentially. There's a lot of that among movie stars who ended up having to part ways but figured out a way to remain close, for the rest of their lives. So there's a number of couples in here. Here's one that might be of some interest. Saint Sergius and Bacchus are the patron saints of the Byzantine army. They were ironically known to be lovers at the time. All the references to them in Greek terminology refer to them as eros, as lovers to each other, and it's believed that they were joined by the ritual called Adelphopoiesis, which was sort of the joining of two men. Ironically, they were closeted Christians, not closeted gay people, and they were outed when they refused to enter the temple of Jupiter because they were Christian. So that was the reason why they ultimately were martyred, and for 1,000 years they were quite venerated in the Eastern Orthodox tradition. They're still considered saints, but they're not like major saints in like the Catholic construct of them. So I believe October 9th is their feast day. So it's just people like that. There's also someone who actually you might recall here. I believe he is now. I know he was beatified. I believe he is now officially a saint. John Henry Newman, who has always been regarded as sort of a patron saint of gay people because of his relationship with Father Ambrose St. John. They lived together for 38 years, and when Ambrose St. John died, Father Newman swore that the grief of a husband losing a wife could never possibly exceed his, and insisted and demanded that upon his own death that he be interred with his bones in the same crypt along with Father Ambrose St. John. So the interesting thing is, once someone becomes a saint, their remains are taken to the Vatican. Well, the two bodies were intertwined together in the same grave. So the belief basically is that they had to take both sets of remains and entomb them together. So that was very eye-opening to me. There's no indication that there was ever any breach of priestly celibacy between them, but the passion and the personal letters between them indicated that there was a profound relationship between these two men. Father Ambrose St. John actually even followed Father Newman, who had been an Anglican priest, followed him into the priesthood just to be with him. And they remained together for the balance of Father Ambrose St. John's life. So I thought it's a lovely story in a way.
Mm. Well, some of these people, I guess, predate Christianity, and a lot of the Sodom and Gomorrah stories and all of that. Were you able to tell if there was a different philosophy about same-sex relationships back then, BC, in that era?
From what I have been able to tell, and I am by no means a complete expert on this, but from what I have been able to tell, the world was not as hung up on it back then as it was here. Relations between people of the same gender were actually quite common. They were common all the way up, through the times. The Egyptians, obviously practiced homosexuality, and many of, from my perspective as a Christian in the study that I have done around this issue, of course I bring a different perspective to it because I'm a gay Christian. The things that I have read that sort of talk about where a lot of the biblical prescriptions actually came from really do seem to be more culturally driven and less religiously driven. And it kind of makes sense when you think about the fact that except for the few passages in the Old Testament that talk about it, there really is not much more to it. Yet you compare it to how many other things were really beaten into people as far as trust and lying and all the other virtues. It gives you a different kind of perspective, and it begins to make me think that a lot of the prescription that came about around this particular subject was driven by cultural fear that drove people into the closet even at that time. And so, how do people change is when they actually meet and get to know somebody and talk to them and understand what their lives are like. Like I said, I come from a Christian tradition, so I can't hate Christians because I am a Christian. My mother was a Christian, all my family are Christians. I can't hate straight people because my mother was a straight person. My best friend is a straight person. It's because I know those people. That's where I come from. I can't have those feelings. But for gay people who have to remain in the closet, it ends up being a situation where they can stand literally in a room and be hated by the people who claim to love them around them, because the people who are doing the hating don't realize it. They don't realize how it's being heard. So to me, it's really just about getting to know people. And there's always going to be people who have a problem with it. That's okay. Not everybody has to agree with me, but I'm a human being. I'm here. I'm doing my thing. I'm not bothering anybody. And if this wall and the information that it has here can help one kid not commit suicide, then my job is done.
Now, I've seen the display with the Native Americans, and I believe it says two-spirited people. Mm-hmm. Is there a spiritual belief that Native Americans tend to have about people who are perhaps LGBT?
Well, I know something about this, but I'm not an expert. So it was my teachable moment when I first learned about this. Two-spirit people are, the term has been adopted largely by indigenous tribes all over the world, but they're somewhat different depending upon what continent they're on. So when we talk about two-spirit here contemporarily, it's really focused on North America, so it's like Canadian, First Nations, and Native Americans, right? So those are the tribes we're really talking about. Those tribes, interestingly, do not recognize the difference between Canada and the United States. They refer to the entire landmass as Turtle Island, right? So the tribes flowed across the borders. Those political boundaries were created by white people. So in their tradition, where the term two-spirit came from is that they believe that there are certain people who are chosen by God to be inhabited with two souls, both a male soul and a female soul. And these individuals, historically, centuries ago, were considered to be the chosen ones. They were the shaman, they were the healers, they were the educators. They would even go so far as to have tests that they would do with small children to try and identify if they were destined to be two-spirit by seeing which toy they chose to play with. And if it appeared that was the path their life was going to evolve towards, they were educated differently, they were raised differently, because they were considered to be blessings to the tribe. And what would end up happening is, and it's a really complicated sort of socio-sexual paradigm that far eclipses anything that Western civilization ever came up with. But you have to try and open your mind and expand these possibilities where you could have a biological male and a biological female joined in the same marriage, but the female was the male in the relationship and the male was the female. Or you could have two people of the same gender together, but one took the male role and one took the female role. Or then you add in passivity and aggression and all these different things, and it becomes this really, really complicated matrix. But the thing is, they were cool with however it was, because those people were in love with each other, and they created whatever kind of relationship they were going to have with each other. And they were celebrated and, like I said, seen as blessings. But then what ended up happening, of course, white people came along, and they brought with them Western civilization and all different kind of missionaries and things, and they started recognizing that there were these individuals who clearly did not look like they were supposed to according to the values that were being asserted upon them. And what ends up happening when you have a dominant culture and a culture that gets subsumed by it, right? You have the people who see this massive force encroaching upon them, and within that smaller group, there are some folks that decide that they're going to side with the power, right? And they're going to sell out the people who got the short end of the stick. So what ends up happening is there were a lot of people that were willing to go through this assimilation process, and people who were truly unique, like Two-Spirit people, got pushed further and further to the periphery. Homophobia came and set in, and eventually these people who were once venerated were kicked out of their tribes, and they were left to their own devices. So the plaque that we have on North Halstead Street, and these are the plaques that we have, our memorial to Two-Spirit people is one of the only memorials that actually exists, and they come every year on the anniversary of its dedication and do a blessing ceremony, because we have chosen to try and honor them and to help them in their struggle to reclaim their place in their tribe. So it's a really, really touching story, and I had so much personal education that I had to do around this. I'm really passionate about Two-Spirit.
Out of all the people that you've studied across the world, are there some cultures that are more accepting than others, or some more condemning than others? What has been your observation?
I think it probably would not be too surprising to say that cultures where the church plays an extremely aggressive role, and that's not just the Christian church, it could be the Muslim church, any place like that, any of those cultures are likely to be more restricting in terms of personal expression, shall we say. And that can take a variety of forms. It can take the forms of sort of gently not really approving, all the way up to murdering people, right? So it's a spectrum. But I would have to say that clearly the Western world has become more comfortable with this subject matter because people have been empowered to come out, and that's really how things change. If people come out of the closet, then other people meet them, and what we see now basically is over the last 30 years there's been a huge migration of people out of the closet. So I think for a lot of folks, they think that everyone is turning gay. The truth of the matter is we have always been here. If anything, this whole installation proves to you we have been around for thousands of years, and we're basically just kind of like the same as y'all, just a little bit different. That's just a little bit different, but we're no better and we're no worse. It's like having blue eyes, it's just, or left-handed. It's just a different kind of thing. And I always, I've got an app on my phone that lists all the abominations, and every once in a while I check in on it, and it's like, this is still the one. Nobody worries about eating pork or wearing red or wearing polyester. Or anything. There's all kinds of things that people do not obsess about, but this particular thing got infused in politics, and it got stuck, and now what we're seeing happen is just this huge shift that's happening in society. And I personally feel very blessed to be living in a time when I get to witness that process firsthand, and have lived through from what it was like when I was born in the 50s to Lord knows how much longer I will be alive. But my guess is in the next 50 years I'm probably going to see a lot, so it's pretty awesome.
One last question. In taking this exhibit to schools, do you find that it empowers some students to perhaps come out and talk about it?
On school campuses, it's hard because people don't really talk to us because we're not out there all the time. We basically bring it there and we leave it, right? And then they do their own thing. There are already campus groups, so there's identifiable LGBTQ organizations that already exist. Now, whether or not there is someone there who isn't a part of that organization or is still in the closet or still has fear, if this has an impact on them, I can only speak from my personal experience of how different my life would be if I had grown up with this. And that's really what this is about, so that the people that we regard as our children, the people who are going to inherit everything that we have tried to do and the changes that we have tried to make, we need to give them a reason to steward this movement forward, and they're not going to do that unless they are aware of what their past was. So if they come out of the closet because of it, then this hopefully will make that process a little easier.
And for those who don't know what the term LGBTQ means, could you break that down?
It is lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender.
Many great people have been part of the LGBT community, and we need to understand that all of us are unique so that we can appreciate the difference. It's been a learning experience, and perhaps someone you know may be part of a community that has been persecuted wrongly and now may be more understood. I'm Naima Latif. We'll see you next time.